Well, it is really my pleasure to be here. I'm actually thrilled to see that this science is taking off, and we have a group of leaders who are going to disseminate it much, much further. I'm a basic neuroscientist, and a lot of the work in my laboratory, I go to work every day, but really I go to the laboratory every day and try to figure out what is going on in the brain after early experiences have their impact. And I've been involved in the National Scientific Council for the Developing Child. I'm a member of that council since the initiation of the council, and contributing brain science. As a result of that, I've given a lot of talks across the country and talked to lots and lots of bodies of people about the brain science. And I think the message is getting across at this point. What happens is you talk about this information, people are very excited while they're in the room, and then they go back to their regular lives, and it doesn't go as far as you wish it would go. You want people to be able to use it. So I have to say that over the last 5 or 6 years, I've spent a huge amount of time not doing brain science, which is what I do in my real life, but trying to come up with creative new ways to get people like you to be able to say this message and then take it further. Take it to every audience you can. Leave them with something that they can send the message even further. My feeling is we won't really be doing our jobs unless we are empowering, and yes, the word would be empowering, everybody we talk to, everybody who hears this story to tell this story. So I'm going to give you a small overview to the basics of brain science and the effects of stress on the brain to set you up for my new, most exciting initiative, which is the brain game. And you'll see at your table, you're going to be able to play this game. Where did this game come from? Well, it came from me and other members of the National Scientific Council going out and giving talks and realizing that we're having a little bit of trouble in translation, getting people to take the information and go use it themselves. It seemed like we needed a hands-on way to get people to use the information we're talking about right there before they leave the room, so that it really instantiates into their thinking. They really can do something with it. And the idea of the brain game was born. Pat Levitt is also a member of the National Scientific Council, and he took a job at the University of Southern California and happened to realize that there's the George Lucas School of Serious Gaming. Yes, people can get a PhD in serious gaming. And this is a large number of very creative people. And they develop games to get people to learn concepts, social concepts, concepts that we use in our everyday lives. And so we've worked with Mariantina Godas to develop the brain game. And you'll see when you get to play it that you're going to build a brain. You're going to try to make it as tall as you can and as sturdy as you can. What are the rules? Well, there's a set of cards, and the cards give you life experiences. And just like real life, some of those life experiences are going to be positive. Some of those life experiences are going to be stressful but tolerable. And some are going to be toxic and do damage to the brain you're trying to build. Later in life, we're going to see how your brain holds up. In older childhood, you will get stresses, and the stresses will have weights. And if you've built a sturdy brain with lots of positive support from parents, from community, from neighbors, from society, your brain is going to withstand those stresses. I've been taking this brain game to groups, mostly to legislative groups, for the last year and a half, and getting them to play it. And it's been just remarkable. And I'll relate one of my very favorite comments, which was I had a group of legislators playing the game, and one of the tables had their brain collapse under stress. And when I went to the table, one of the legislators that was at that table said, you know, we were really good at this game, and we understood how to build a brain, and we did a good job. It wasn't our fault. We just got dealt some bad cards. And I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. He goes, oh my gosh, that's the point, isn't it? These kids aren't bad. Their parents aren't bad. They got dealt some bad cards. And he said, I'm going to renew my efforts to really try to put social structures in place that will help children like this. And I was like, yes, he got the message. But I think he got the message because he got a hands-on experience to do something that reinforced the things we all say. So I'm going to give you a brief overview, and I see, looking at the time, that we have managed to have lots of comments and have kind of eaten into the time. And you're all experts on this anyway, so I'm going to go relatively fast because I want you to have time to play this game, and I want you to see how valuable it is. And then I want you to take this game forward and use it with others. I would hope that this would do a lot of good. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the basics of brain science and how a brain is built and how stresses and positive events come together to change brain development. I'll cover the 3 principles of the core story of brain development that I think you've probably heard many times. I'm just going to turn that. That brain architecture is established early in life and supports lifelong learning, behavior, and health. That stable, caring relationships are key, and that toxic stress in the early years of life can be very damaging. So, the brain. This is what I study every day, and we tend to think of the brain as being one organ, but the brain is not. It's as if you had a series of brains, each doing different things, all put together. So, I wonder if I can use, no, I have a pointer. Anyway, at the front of the brain, you have the frontal cortex, and you see it there labeled working memory. This part of the brain is going to be responsible for planning, for reasoning, for things you think about when you think about thinking. But there are other parts of the brain. The top of the brain, you have an area that controls motor function. I can use my hands while I'm speaking because of that part of the brain. And it's only that part of the brain connected to pathways that go down to my hands. It's not the front or the back. There's vision, there's hearing. Each part of the brain develops at a different rate, and this is important to keep in mind because brain development isn't just one thing. Every small part of the brain develops at its own rate, and the impact that a stress is going to have is going to be in very large part determined by when the stress occurred. If it occurred when that particular brain area was developing, that area is going to be very impacted. So you can talk to people and they can say, I had this horrible, stressful early life experience when I was 3 months old, and somebody else had the same stressful life experience when they were 6 months old. But they don't have the same outcome. And we wonder about, what's that all about? What's this heterogeneity? they had different parts of their brain developing at those times. Now, there may have been lots of other circumstances. No two people are in exactly the same circumstance, so no two stressful life events are exactly the same. Nevertheless, one of the biggest indicators of what is going to be different is what part of the brain was developing while the stress was occurring. So when we think about brain development, the key to remember is that you're born with almost all the nerve cells. You have all the brain cells. We call them neurons. So if this is a brain cell and this is a brain cell, you already have them in place by and large at the time that you're born. What happens over development, and when we talk about brain development, what we mean is that these cells are connecting. Lots of connections are being formed. So you see neurons in the brain at birth by 3 years of age. But you already know I shouldn't have labeled that 3 years of age, right? Depends on the part of the brain we're talking about. So for some parts of the brain, like the visual cortex, most of the connections and most of the development in this back part of the brain is going to occur in the first year of life. So that's when all the plasticity is going on. It's why it's so important to have children have visual checks when they're born and then correct problems while there is plasticity in the system. Now, we're all in luck. The front part of the brain, the part of the brain that is responsible for reasoning and higher order thinking, develops over a long period of time. And we have a period of plasticity where we can affect it over a long period of time. So while the connections are being formed is different for different brain regions, and then the very technical but yet scientific word that gets used for which connections stay and which connections go is pruning. Yep, neuroscientists talk about pruning. You can actually go to sessions on neural pruning. So some of these connections stay and some of them fade away. Who determines who stays? That's where experience is everything. Connections that get used a lot are going to stay in place. They get strengthened. Connections that don't get used very much are at risk of being pruned. And that is really the neuroscience underpinning of everything you're going to think about over the next day or so. It really matters what your experiences are. So now let's look at those different brain areas. You see in the yellow pathway that sensory pathways, vision, hearing, are developing connections in the prenatal period and right after birth. And then pruning occurs over the first year of life. Language development, you get connections being formed over the first year or two of life, and then pruning over the subsequent several years. It's much easier to teach a child a foreign language and have them be able to speak it fluently if you do so when they're young. If you wait until they're in high school, that's when I learned my foreign languages, you don't do them very well, and I can guarantee you I don't. Why not? My brain wasn't plastic. I could still learn new languages. When you don't have brain plasticity, does that mean you have no hope? No. What it means is you have to use those brain circuits that you've got to do all the work. Your brain circuits aren't finely tuned for doing what you're doing. So when I learned Spanish and German in high school, I could use the brain circuits that underlie language, and I could do reasonably well. If I worked really hard, I could get a B. I could kind of speak Spanish and German, but not all that well. If I had been taught when I was 4 or 5, I would have learned much more easily. It would have taken less money. We would have had to pay less teachers to teach me Spanish and German. And my teachers at high school would have retained their hair instead of pulling it out. And I would have learned much more effectively because I would have had some plasticity and been able to adapt those circuits to being able to do that. So that's the difference. Now, higher order cognitive function has connections being made during the first 12 or so years of life, and then pruning occurs till young adulthood. About the time kids are 25 years old, we really have an end of plasticity in that area. Now, we can still learn to reason, and we should all remember that because we need to send that message to Washington right now. You can still learn to reason. However, you cannot get new brain circuits that are going to do that really efficiently. And we might say, well, that's obvious. Okay, so several years ago, on my continuing mission to try to develop tools for people to be able to give this message without having neuroscientists come and give it, because a really very limited number of neuroscientists that can come do this, the National Scientific Council made 3 videos, and it took us a number of years to develop these. These are freely downloadable. The website address is right there. I think you will have these slides available to you. You can go get these videos and please make use of them. Early life stress impacts lifelong health. How does it do this? It really does it 2 ways. It's cumulative over time, but very importantly, as I explained earlier, it gets embedded. The effects of the stress get embedded in the brain, in the circuits that are developing, and we call that period of time for neural circuits the sensitive period. So during the period of pruning in development, the circuits are very susceptible to the experiences and how the circuit will end up being formed. When we think about stresses, we think about 3 types of stresses. Positive stresses, and this was shown in the video that Michelle showed very nicely. Tolerable stresses, these can be significant stresses, but the child has the resources to cope with them. There are adults that care about them. There are societal institutions in place to help them deal with the stresses. And toxic stress. Many times toxic stresses are the same stresses that we consider tolerable, but in this case, there are no resources available to that child. And so the child is left not understanding the world, not understanding the situation, and being panicked about what is going to happen. What are the sources of toxic stress in life? Well, they're neglect, abuse, things like a dysfunctional home, and in many parts of the world, societal upheaval. When we think about what contributes in places like the United States and Canada to toxic stress, this is a very nice chart, and it's sometimes very surprising to people. You might think that maltreatment or abuse would be the most worrisome aspect of toxic stress, and that's not the case. In the little green people, you see data that says that 75 out of 1,000 children will experience maltreatment. However, much greater numbers are going to experience postpartum depression of a parent, shown in blue, or parental substance abuse, shown in red. Those things, which you might not think as being so difficult for a developing child, have a much bigger impact on the developing brain than you might think, because even though the parent is there, they're not mentally there, tuned into the child, helping guide the child's development. Who experiences these? Well, all children experience them from all walks of life, but poor children experience them at a higher rate. Here you're looking at blood levels of stress hormones. And what you can see in a 9-year-old white child is that children growing up in poverty, shown in the orange bars, have higher levels of these stress-related hormones than children that are growing up in middle-income families. Poverty is a big risk factor for developing toxic stress problems. What are the impacts of toxic stress? I'll just run through these slides very quickly. You know this probably better than I do. Here we're looking at data from the ACEs study showing that as there are increasing numbers of toxic stresses, you have an increase in developmental delays. That might be one of the first things you see in children. You have an increase in addiction, alcoholism, illicit drugs. You have an increase in adult depression. You have an increase in adult cardiovascular function and a lot of other health problems. I think it's very interesting when we're starting to think about how do these stresses have such a big impact? Well, we know now that lots of normal life events that we think go on around us, like depression, like substance abuse, really contribute in a major way. But another issue is work that was done by Seth Pollack. I see the reference is cut off in Wisconsin, which was a very interesting study. He is a psychologist and he used computer generation of faces. So on the far left, you see happy faces and they go to fearful. And he used a computer program to morph the faces between happy and fearful. Here, between happy and sad, or angry and fearful, or angry and sad. And then he brought in children and asked them to determine where's the halfway point? When do they switch? And what we see is that normal children looking between angry and fearful, for example, say, well, they switch right about in the middle. However, children that had experienced early adversity say they switch much further to the right. They encode anger in faces where other people wouldn't see anger. So how you look at the world and what you see changes. No wonder stress early in life has a long-term impact. It's changing how the brain is built, and it's also changing how you see the brain, how you see the world. If you see the world as being a more adversarial place where there's more anger, you are very likely to have different feelings about what's going on. And these will have lifetime repercussions. How does it impact the brain? Well, you already know that it changes how you see the world. You know that it changes the neural circuitry. It also changes gene expression. And you might think, well, that you were born with all the genes you have. And you are, but you only express some genes. I like to explain this by talking about cooking. If you come into my kitchen, you'll see I love to cook, and I have a lot of recipe books. Does that mean you can have everything in those recipe books when you come to my house? No, you can only have what I choose to cook, which recipes I'm expressing. So think of all those recipes in the cookbooks as my genes. I was born with them, and it doesn't matter. A lot of them you don't get to experience. You only get to experience what I choose to express. The same is true with the genes in every cell in everybody's body. You have a huge set of genes, but each cell only expresses some of them. How does this work? Well, here's our neuron, our working brain cell. And if we look in the nucleus inside, we're going to see a chromosome that carries the genes you were born with and DNA. The DNA contains the genes. Now, early experiences are going to have an effect on the signals that come through that brain cell. And every early experience is going to upregulate or downregulate gene regulatory proteins in the neuron. Those gene regulatory proteins bind to DNA, and they're going to turn on and turn off gene expression. So early experiences have very big effects on what genes your cells are using. The last thing I want to mention as far as how does stress impact the brain is that I'm bringing this slide back to show you it affects hormone secretion and neurotransmitter, the chemicals that neurons talk with secretion. So we've got 4 mechanisms. You change the structure of the brain, you change how you see the world, you change what genes are expressed, and you change what hormones are released. It's no wonder early experiences have such a big impact. What you're here to think about is how can you prevent the long-term health impacts of early stress? And we basically are going to spend much of today talking about how relationships of one type or another are very effective buffers for early life stress. Without caring adults to buffer children, toxic stress that's associated with extreme poverty, neglect, abuse, severe maternal depression can have long-term consequences for learning, behavior, physical, and mental health. How does this work? Well, a current conceptual framework is that children are developing on a healthy trajectory, but if you have significant adversity during early life, you're going to impair health and development. So you're going to change the trajectory for that child. What we really want to do is we want to intervene. You have the same things that lead to healthy development, but we want to put in new protective interventions. And this will prevent significant adversity from being able to change the trajectory for this child. This will be the focus of the rest of your meeting. So I'm going to leave you with this information. What we've learned is that all forms of brain function develop early in life. Supportive relationships are particularly important to encourage brain development, and societal interventions are very important when children don't have the resources of caring adults there to help guide their way. I want you to put this into action now. You're going to see at your table that you have a little bag of building supplies, and you are all going to become brain builders. So put your brain building hat on. I'm going to switch to another set of slides to show you the rules. Okay, so your brain, once it's finished, may look something like this. Although I've been playing this game with thousands of people now, and I can say there's no end to what brains, even very sturdy brains, can look like. What are you going to do here? What is the rules? Okay, so you have 2 sheets of paper, and I think I had them with me. No, I don't. 2 sheets of paper. One is a set of brain rules, brain game rules. I have gone to giving this out at each table because I spend a lot of time talking to legislators, and this actually amazes me, but it may not amaze you. I'll put the rules up on the board. They glance at them. They tolerate listening to me for a few minutes, and then they ignore the rules. And so This game will reinforce the concepts I've just talked to you about much better if you actually follow the rules. Please try. Children are much better at following rules. If you tell them you need to follow the rules, they'll follow them, or if they decide not to, they'll kind of covertly not do it. But adults say, I don't want to follow the rules, and they just don't. Okay, what are the rules? We're going to build our brain, and your goal is to make your brain as tall as possible and as sturdy as possible. And it's going to be built over the first 5 years of life. You are first going to start, somebody around the table is going to roll the dice. And that is really the genes you inherit. You are going to take the number of straws that are indicated on the dice. So if you're lucky, you might roll a 5 or a 6. And straws, in this case, are life support. These are supports for the developing brain. And you can use these straws at any time during the game. Next, there's a stack of cards, and they're sequentially labeled. It's always good to start with year 1. I don't need to tell children this, but very frequently adults think, I don't know, start at year 1, let's try something different. So you want to start at year 1, and you're going to get 3 cards a year. So draw 3 cards, and you need to keep track of which order you drew them in. To help you, there's a second sheet on each table, and it is a scorecard. You're going to nominate somebody at your table to be the scorekeeper, and that's an important job. Each time you draw a card, if it's a positive stress, it will have a smiling face on it. And we now are printing the faces very large, so people my age can see them without putting their glasses on. You'll have a smiling face. You put a check mark in the positive stress column. If you draw a toxic stress, you're going to have a frowning face, and you put a check mark in the toxic stress. And if you get a star, it means it's a tolerable stress. So a tolerable stress is going to be one thing or another, and this is key. This is really about what you're having this meeting about. Tolerable stresses are positive, and there'll be a healthy outcome if there's supports in the system. So if the majority of cards you've drawn so far are positive stresses, you get to count that tolerable stress as a positive stress. That's why you need the scorekeeper. Throughout this game, you need to know how many of each you've had. Yeah, right. Anyway, if the majority of stresses you've had are toxic, then the tolerable stress will count as toxic. If you have an equal number of positive and toxic stresses, you need to roll the dice again. And if you get a 1 or 2 or 3, you're going to count it as positive. If you get a 4, 5, or 6, you're going to count it as toxic. If you're right at the beginning of the game, and the very first card you draw is tolerable, your scorekeeper can't help you out. Roll the dice again. Okay. At the end of each year, you will have drawn 3 cards. Your scorekeeper will have kept track. You will have figured out how many positive and toxic stresses you have. A positive experience gets a pipe cleaner and a straw. So you're going to take from your pile a pipe cleaner and a straw. A toxic stress just gets a pipe cleaner. Obviously, the positive stress is much stronger because you can thread the pipe cleaner through the straw. I thought this was very obvious, and when I deal with children, they get it right away. But I've had some adults say, yeah, how do you connect these straws? Oh, thread the pipe cleaner through the straw. The straw is your societal support. And remember, at the beginning, you had some genetic straws. You can use those straws every time you want to, but you only get them once. If you use them up, then they're gone. Although you might think about this, When is the most important time to use those extra straws? When do societal supports matter the most? You're going to keep each year, you have to use the 3 pieces of building equipment that you got, and you have to make a closed structure. So you can't have free hanging pipe cleaners. They have to all be connected. I saw a beautiful brain one time, and the base of the brain was there, and I'm realizing I forgot to put on the table a base of a brain. So all of you are going to have to start by making the base of the brain. It's going to be a triangle made with 3 pipe cleaners. So you're going to do that before you do anything else. Make a base. And I saw lots and lots of pipe cleaners hanging off the base. And I said, well, what are you doing? Well, we're waiting till we get all 5 years of building equipment, and then we figure we'll have the best way to put this brain together. I said, what's this? Do you think that actually happens to children? They get to just be vegetables for 5 years, and then all of a sudden, lo and behold, woo, the brain grows, and you have a really functional, a super functional young child. That's not quite how the neuroscience works. I decided, oh, those rules are really important. Neuroscience has to follow rules, so do you. Okay, we're going to go into years 6 to 8 after that. And the rules are similar, but not exactly the same. Every time you get a positive experience, now you just get a pipe cleaner. No more straws. You're kind of past that critical stage of brain development, so you just get a pipe cleaner in these years. Toxic stress, you're going to not get any building equipment. You're going to get a weight. And in this case, a weight is a bell that you have to hang from the tallest part of your brain at the time that you get the weight. If you get a tolerable stress, just like previously, you count it as positive or toxic. What you're trying to do is build a tall brain that's as sturdy as possible that can support the life stresses that you get later in life, so it does not collapse under the weight of the weights, the stresses you get later on. Okay, have fun, play. Then they can go out and put it into action. But if you go from just hearing to trying to put things in action, it's very difficult. Okay, thank you.